Thank you for staying till the end of the day. We have recently begun to see a remarkable level of resistance to education technology, as well as other types of technologies. And I experienced this firsthand. About a month ago, when I was starting to think about this talk, I accidentally set a Twitter mob against the developers of a new education technology prototype. Now, here's how I did that. At the moment, I'm doing research on cutting-edge education technologies that are based on brain science and technologies that touch the brain, like this. So I'm looking at neuro headsets and so on, and asking questions about how these change the way in which educators and researchers might understand learning and education. So I came across this as one particular example, the Attentive U brainwave reading goggles from the MIT Media Lab. The idea behind these is that they scan the brain for brainwave or to detect things going on in the brain that indicate whether a student is paying attention. And if the student is not, then they deliver a haptic nudge to the head, bone-conducted sound, as the developers describe it, to kind of nudge the student back into a concentrated state. Now, I thought, wow, this is kind of frightening, kind of funny, maybe kind of cool. So I put on Twitter, check out these cool brain-reading Attentive U glasses from MIT. This is what they think students should wear when viewing online lectures or listening to classroom lectures to physically nudge students to pay attention. Now, I should have put scare quotes around cool. I mean, I felt self-evidently these were not cool. However, Twitter disagreed. For about 48 hours at the end of August, my Twitter notifications were full of references to A Clockwork Orange. These glasses were not cool then, Twitter was telling me. They were a torture device. They were a torture device, especially that would be used against children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And therefore, me amplifying these things, even if I hadn't developed them myself, was something I should be ashamed of. Quite a few other people did notice that these are from MIT Media Lab, that I wasn't responsible for it. Some people did call me a eugenicist. Somebody called me literal human garbage without actually noticing that these weren't mine. However, a number of other people did begin to vent their rage on the team from MIT Media Lab who had created these. I had set a Twitter mob on the developers of an educational technology. Now, I think that this Twitter mob is a kind of extreme expression of this wave of new resistance that we're now beginning to see against education technology. And this resistance to or pushback to Edtech also needs to be understood as situated in the wider context of a growing and global sense of frustration and anxiety about what technology is doing to society and to our behaviors, to our democracy. And these are three sort of prominent books on this topic that have appeared recently. Technology is destabilizing the world. We're living in the age of surveillance capitalism and so on. So the resistance stories that I'm going to briefly outline to you in the education technology field, I think need to be understood in relation to the rise of what some people are calling a techlash, a backlash against big technology. And we can see the examples of this already emerging in education. These are just some quick headline stories from the last year or so. They represent, I think, some emerging themes, some sort of anxiety and resistance themes. One is about the rise of artificial intelligence and how completely opaque AI and machine learning and data analytics processes are beginning to make decisions that we don't understand in schools, coupled with concerns about how biased those systems might be against certain groups of students. There's a rising set of concerns about data privacy when we're collecting, harvesting, and processing unprecedented quantities of student data. And there's also concerns about the role of the big tech companies who are moving very, very swiftly into education. I saw literally at 8:45 this morning on my way here that Amazon yesterday announced an Alexa education API to plug in Alexa to your learning management system, which will allow parents to ask Alexa, how did my son get on in the exam today? How did my daughter behave at lunchtime today? Check that out on the Amazon Alexa Education API page. So we're seeing a wave of news stories that sort of indicate this sense of frustration and resistance to education technology. But we're also seeing the rise of a number of prominent Edtech, critical Edtech activists. Prominent amongst them is Audrey Waters, who writes the fantastic website Hack Education, really drawing attention to issues in education technology for a wider audience than those who normally think about education technology. Drawing attention to issues of privacy, of surveillance, of commercial control, of the disempowerment and deprofessionalization of teachers, and the way in which, her argument is, a lot of modern education technologies treat children like pigeons who can be trained in a Skinner box. So Audrey Waters is kind of leading this EdTech resistance. We're also seeing resistance framed by feminist theory and practice. The Fem-Ed-Tech movement is very much focused on issues of diversity, not just for girls, but also for all sorts of other minority groups that experience injustice and inequalities and so on. So the Fem-Ed-Tech movement is both trying to address issues of lack of diversity in the education technology sector itself, which tends not to employ as many women as men, but also addressing issues of how might education technologies themselves be gendered or perhaps racialized. Might it be that personalized learning adaptive technologies favor the model of learning that self-taught white male programmers like? Programmers who like teaching themselves through the web. Is that the kind of model that's very gendered and racialized that comes through education technology? Or asking questions about something like the introduction of coding and computer science in schools. I believe England was the first country to have a kind of curriculum subject on computer science. What's the result been 7 years later? We now have fewer girls than ever before doing any kind of computer-based subject in schools. This is clearly not the way to develop long-term a diverse STEM workforce. Some specific examples of moments of EdTech resistance, and you may have heard this one. Summit Schools in the States is funded by the Mark Zuckerberg's for-profit philanthropy. It was built, the personalized learning platform in it was built by Facebook engineers. About this time last year, there was a wave of student walkouts and protests in Summit Schools. Some of it was to do with issues of data privacy and data sharing. They were uncomfortable with the way that Summit was suggesting it might share some data with third-party service providers. Some of it, however, was to do with what the students described, particularly in a letter they wrote directly to Zuckerberg, that the personalized learning platform was boring, that it didn't prepare them for exams, it was individualized, and it stuck them at a computer, and it didn't allow them to engage in interaction with their peers or teachers in a way that they felt would support the development of their critical skills. So we had these points of resistance here. I think what we can learn from that is that these students were suggesting there's not necessarily widespread trust in engineering solutions to schoolings. That students themselves are saying, hang on, these systems, these automated personalized learning systems, seem to be about efficiency rather than actually about equipping us with the critical life skills that we require. Another example is Altschool. People know Altschool. This was a kind of Silicon Valley startup school started by an ex-Googler called Max Ventilla, a few years ago, very quickly got $174 million of investment from venture capitalists in the States to start up this new chain of schools, entirely going to be based on personalized learning technologies. They were going to have cameras in the room filming the kids and the teachers, so they'd have this kind of constant data collection machinery, scanning what happened, how children interacted with each other or with the computer, completely constantly recording their progress on all sorts of different metrics, whether academic, social, emotional, and so on. Not that long ago, just earlier this year, suddenly Altschool said, actually, we're wrapping up the schools business. So they run schools for a few years, and we're just going to focus on the product. So basically what Altschool had been doing, it set up a series of schools. I think it had 8 or 9 in the end in the States. It had all of these children that it attracted parents, it recruited children, and it treated them as guinea pigs in a kind of live, personalized learning experiment. That, at least, was one of the critiques that was leveled against this. And this investor, Jason Palmer, recently said, look, we never invested in Altschool because, frankly, it was a terrible idea in the first place. The result for this guy, Jason Palmer, he's a venture capitalist, right? Was all the venture capitalists in the Edtech investment sector turned on him. They said tweeting this is toxic behavior. This is what the New York Times, in commenting on this, called the Silicon Valley positivity machine. These tech companies refuse to engage with failure, and they refuse to engage with the possible negative social effects of the technologies they're developing. As a result, you might have a massive failure like Altschool, which simply can't run a school, but it's still rolling out its product under the new brand name Altitude. We also see some resistances to some quite mundane dysfunctions. And one is this story that came out just recently based on an investigation into automated essay scoring. Now, automated essay scoring is all over the place in the States. It's a big priority of the UK government at the moment. It's part of our national Edtech strategy. We're all going to have automated essay scoring to support teachers, free up teachers to do more creative things. This study looked very closely at these and found 2 problems. One, they're completely biased against disadvantaged groups because they've been trained on data which has already historically disadvantaged kids from Black, and from Hispanic, or from Asian origins, and so on. The second problem, and this is perhaps even more frustrating, is that automated essay scoring rewards well-written gibberish. So you can write nonsense, but if you write it well, automated essay scoring will give it a good grade. Because it doesn't care what you write, it can't assess for meaning, it just assesses for structure. If that's correct, there's a huge industry of this. It's all the way across education systems all over the world, and yet it doesn't work. So I think we need to ask questions as educators about all these promises of algorithmic accuracy and efficiency gains and so on might actually be working against us and working against the students in our care. Some of you may be familiar with this story. This is the Swedish General Data Protection Regulation fine of a Swedish school recently for introducing biometric facial detection at roll call. The Swedish government under GDPR has fined the school, not the provider of the tech, the school has been fined for introducing this. Interestingly, it said because although consent had been sought from the students, the balance of power was clearly with the school because children don't really have any option but to attend school. I think this raises some really difficult questions for us about the regulatory environment that we're in now under GDPR. There are certainly a number of raising concerns and debates about to what extent can students genuinely opt out under GDPR from systems that are absolutely integral and essential to the functioning of our educational institutions. I think this is my final example. And this is a live story that's going on, rumbling on in the UK. It's not just an Edtech resistance story. This is a political scandal in the UK of pretty astonishing proportions. So some years ago, 2014, the Home Office, the government Home Office, launched an investigation into claims of widespread cheating at English language testing centres for international students studying or wishing to study in the UK. And as part of that investigation, it got the English language testing service in to run voice recognition, biometric analysis of the recordings of all these students who had gone and done this oral or spoken test at these testing centres. What it found, or what it reported, was that 59% of the students had cheated. This is 59% out of a sample of 66,000 students. And it found another 38% were questionable. What did the Home Office do immediately? It revoked the visas of 33,000 international students studying in the UK. 2,500 of those students were forcibly removed from the country. Something like 7,000 more left voluntarily. The result, there were many claims that up to 20% of the time, the voice matching algorithm may have actually been getting this wrong. As a result, there's now a wave of appeals going through the courts in the UK. 12,500 court cases, individual court cases in the UK by students who have been accused of cheating by a biometric voice detection piece of software. Now, this even led to a National Audit Office investigation. This is like our official investigative office. And in fact, we've just had a parliamentary inquiry. It reported literally at the end of last week. So I was just able to put this in before our hosts demanded the slides from me. What this inquiry found, the software that was used to revoke the visas of 33,000 students had never been tested or proven. So unproven, untested software was being used in our education system to make life-changing decisions that would affect the long-term potential of many thousands of students. So we come back to the outrage that I experienced in relation to the brain goggles that I showed you at the beginning. Now, that product is one of a wave of things that are emerging at the moment, which are attempting to collect more and more intimate data about the bodies and the brains of students. So there are now suggestions that it might be possible to have DNA IQ tests. So IQ tests based on a saliva sample in a tube. A bit like 23andMe does your kind of ancestry services, and so on. Or there's this other project from Progrentis and Brainco. Brainco develops these headsets for gathering learning data in real time while a student is completing tasks. Progrentis is a personalized learning platform provider. These two companies have just launched what they call a neuro-optimized education platform. So this is now about feeding brain data collected from the signals that are escaping from students' leaky skulls and using that data to personalize the kind of micro learning experiences that they encounter in the platform. Now, this is really ethically grey area we're moving into here. We had a report out last week in the UK from the Royal Society, our highest level kind of scientific learned society, suggesting that brain bands like this really, really need to be regulated because their development is exploding. They're being marketed across all sorts of sectors, including education, with the promise of things like cognitive enhancement. The Nuffield Bioethics Council is all over issues around the explosion in bioinformatic analysis of DNA and the possible consequences of starting to make decisions about people or make predictions about their intelligence, about their achievement, about their attainment, based on what is written into the body from birth. It is really no wonder that some people on Twitter shouted eugenicist when I shared the MIT brain goggles, because those are the kinds of concerns, I think, which emerge from these kinds of technologies. I think we need to pay attention to these emerging points of Edtech resistance. I think they teach us something about what to avoid. They give us some signals about what sort of public outrage might be caused by some of these technologies. They give us some sense of how students might respond if we emphasize efficiency or if we strap devices to their bodies. And I think these things also should support us to think about what kinds of education systems, as educators, we really want to develop that are just and that are trustworthy and that are equitable. Thank you very much.